Berlin, 1941. Inside the marble halls of the Air Ministry, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring leaned back in his chair, cigar smoke curling through the room. He laughed when he read the intercepted American production goals. 50,000 aircraft in 1 year. To Göring and the Luftwaffe staff, the number sounded impossible. Germany, already the most heavily industrialized power in Europe, had taken 6 years to produce that many planes. The United States, still at peace and with an army smaller than Romania's, had almost no large-scale aircraft factories. How can a nation of car salesmen and film stars build 50,000 planes? Göring joked to his aides. Even Hitler chuckled at the idea, calling it an American fantasy. What neither of them understood was that the United States was about to awaken an industrial force unlike anything the world had seen. When President Franklin Roosevelt announced the goal in 1940, many in Congress doubted him too. But Roosevelt's challenge wasn't just a number. It was a declaration that the arsenal of democracy would outbuild, out-engineer, and outlast tyranny itself. Across America, the auto plants of Detroit, the shipyards of California, and the steel mills of Pennsylvania began to stir. Engineers who once designed sedans started drawing blueprints for bombers. Women entered factories by the hundreds of thousands, riveting aluminum and wiring instrument panels. The gears of mass production that had built cars for every household would soon build the aircraft that would dominate the skies. By the end of the war, Göring's laughter would be replaced by disbelief. The same country he mocked would roll out over 100,000 combat aircraft, more than twice what he thought was possible. The bet he laughed at would become the measure of Germany's defeat. When President Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress in December 1940 and declared that America must become the great arsenal of democracy, few understood what that meant. At the time, the United States ranked 18th in military strength, behind even Portugal. Its army was smaller than the police force of New York City. Its aircraft factories produced barely 6,000 planes a year, most of them outdated trainers. But Roosevelt's words weren't a boast. They were a challenge. He knew that American industry, if unleashed, could do what no nation in history had ever attempted. Transform peacetime factories into a war machine capable of supplying the entire free world. Detroit, the heart of America's auto industry, was the first to answer. Henry Ford's company, famous for the Model T, began converting its assembly lines to aircraft production. In 1941, construction began on a massive new factory at Willow Run, Michigan, designed to produce the B-24 Liberator bomber. It was the largest factory on Earth, a single mile-long building capable of turning out a completed bomber every hour. Every industry followed suit. General Motors produced engines and guns. Chrysler built tank components. Goodyear made tires for bombers instead of cars. The sewing machine companies switched to parachutes. And millions of Americans, men and women, poured into the workforce, welding, riveting, and assembling the machinery of freedom. Within months, aircraft output skyrocketed. By the end of 1941, America had already built more planes than in the previous 3 years combined. The arsenal of democracy had come to life. And in Berlin, Hermann Göring's intelligence officers began to send uneasy reports. The Americans were serious. The laughter in the Reich Air Ministry began to fade. Before 1941, Detroit was known for automobiles, not bombers. But when America entered the war, the city that once built cars for millions began building weapons for democracy. Assembly lines that once turned out chrome and steel sedans were stripped down, redesigned, and rebuilt to produce the hardware of global warfare. Henry Ford's Willow Run plant became the beating heart of this transformation. The factory was so large that it had its own railway system and 100,000 workers operating around the clock. Under bright fluorescent lights, workers assembled the B-24 Liberator, a heavy bomber that could fly 2,000 miles and carry 8,000 pounds of bombs. At its peak, Willow Run produced one bomber every 63 minutes, an achievement Göring's Luftwaffe engineers refused to believe possible. Across town, General Motors converted its automobile plants to manufacture engines, tanks, and aircraft parts. The Cadillac division produced tank engines, while Buick built fighter aircraft parts and amphibious vehicles. Even the luxury car makers like Packard were retooled, producing Rolls-Royce Merlin engines that powered the P-51 Mustang, the aircraft that would later dominate German skies. The rhythm of the city changed. Detroit's skyline glowed at night as furnaces roared and assembly lines never stopped. Men who once sold cars now forged armor plates. Women in coveralls replaced mechanics at the lines, earning the nickname Rosie the Riveter. For many, it was their first time working in a factory, but they learned fast, driven by purpose and pride. By 1943, Detroit alone produced more military equipment than all of Germany combined. The city that built cars became the engine of Allied victory. And Hermann Göring, once confident in German industry's dominance, was forced to face a truth he could no longer ignore. America was no longer just a producer. It was a war machine. What made America unstoppable wasn't just resources. It was mass production. Before the war, the US perfected the moving assembly line, where machines and workers worked in harmony. When war came, that same system was turned into a weapon. Factories learned to build aircraft the same way they built cars, not one at a time, but in endless flow. At Douglas Aircraft, engineers reorganized every step, breaking plane construction into thousands of repeatable tasks. Each worker mastered one movement, each tool had a purpose, and each hour produced results. The effect was staggering. By 1943, American factories were rolling out 8,000 aircraft per month. Germany, fighting under constant bombing, could barely manage a quarter of that. The difference wasn't skill, it was scale. The United States had space, oil, steel, and a workforce of 50 million ready to adapt. When a bomber factory ran short of aluminum, a car plant supplied it within days. When tank production slowed, shipyards loaned their welders. No other nation could shift its industry so fast or so freely. The Germans still relied on specialized workshops and handcrafting, engineers with perfect tools, but limited numbers. American factories favored volume and reliability over perfection. A B-24 might not have looked elegant, but it could be built by the thousands. And that was the math that decided wars. By the time Göring realized what was happening, it was too late. The Luftwaffe's factories were being bombed daily, while the Americans built entire new ones faster than they could be destroyed. Every week, more planes arrived in England, more bombers crossed the Channel, and more German cities burned under the roar of engines built by men and women who once made sedans. The world's first true industrial war had begun, and the nation built for business had become the master of destruction. When the United States went to war, more than 10 million men left their jobs and went overseas. Factories that were expanding by the hour suddenly faced a new crisis. There were not enough hands to keep production going. The solution came from the one group the pre-war economy had largely overlooked: American women. Posters went up across the nation. Do the job he left behind. By 1943, women made up 1/3 of the entire American workforce. They welded, riveted, assembled engines, and loaded ammunition. In Detroit, at the Ford Willow Run plant, women fastened the wings of B-24 bombers with precision. At Douglas Aircraft, women fitted gun turrets. At shipyards on both coasts, they worked through the night, sparks flying from torches in their hands. They were given new names: Rosies, Wendy the Welders, Wows, women ordnance workers. But they were more than symbols. They were the industrial backbone of the United States. By 1944, nearly 19 million women were working in war production. Factories once staffed by skilled male engineers now ran entirely with female crews. And production didn't slow. It accelerated. Most had never touched heavy machinery before the war. But necessity and training changed that. In a few short months, women mastered complex tools and techniques. They learned to read blueprints, manage assembly lines, and inspect aircraft for defects. Their work was exacting and dangerous. High temperatures, toxic fumes, long shifts. But the results spoke for themselves. In every factory, a silent shift had taken place. The workers who once built cars or typewriters were now building tanks, ships, and bombers. Every engine that roared over Europe carried their effort in its metal. By the end of the war, women had built nearly half of all U.S. aircraft, a contribution that no general or strategist could ever equal. Hermann Göring, who once mocked American industry as soft and disorganized, had never imagined an army of riveters, mechanics, and welders, millions of civilians who turned labor into firepower. By 1944, the American war machine had reached a level no one, least of all Hermann Göring, had believed possible. Factories once built for cars and refrigerators were now producing aircraft faster than Germany could shoot them down. The numbers were staggering. In 1940, before the buildup began, the United States had produced just 3,000 aircraft. By 1941, that number climbed to 19,000. A year later, 47,000. And by 1944, American factories rolled out over 96,000 planes in a single year. Every hour of every day, 10 new aircraft took flight somewhere across the United States. From small trainers to the massive B-29 Superfortress, the skies were filling with American engineering. At one point, there were so many aircraft coming off production lines that the U.S. Army Air Forces had to build new airfields simply to store them. Compare that to Germany. Despite its early lead and centralized planning, the Reich's entire wartime output barely reached 119,000 combat aircraft, produced under constant bombing and with dwindling fuel and materials. The U.S. matched that total in little more than a year. The scale of American industry was beyond comprehension. One B-17 bomber contained more than 350,000 parts and 9,000 feet of wiring. Yet factories built them as easily as Germany built cars. Every rivet, every wing section, was part of a system designed for one purpose: volume. To Göring's intelligence officers, the reports seemed impossible. But they were real. The same nation he dismissed as a land of consumers had become the arsenal of the modern world. Its power measured not in speeches, but in production schedules. By 1944, Germany was running out of fuel, aluminum, and pilots. America was running out of storage space. The war of machines had already been decided. By 1943, the Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force on Earth, was starting to collapse under the weight of American production. When the war began, Göring's pilots had ruled the skies from Poland to Paris. But now the balance had shifted. Every month, thousands of new American bombers and fighters filled the air, each one a product of factories Göring had laughed at just 2 years earlier. At first, the Luftwaffe tried to match them. German engineers built faster, more advanced aircraft, the FW-190, the Bf-109G, and later the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter. But it didn't matter. No matter how advanced the designs were, there simply weren't enough of them. For every German plane destroyed, the Americans built 5 more. The Allied bombing campaign intensified. Hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators roared toward German cities every day, escorted by squadrons of P-51 Mustangs with long-range fuel tanks that allowed them to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. The Luftwaffe scrambled to intercept them, but their numbers were thinning and their fuel was vanishing. By the spring of 1944, the sky over Germany had become a battlefield the Reich could no longer control. Entire squadrons of bombers appeared over industrial centers like Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Berlin. Anti-aircraft guns thundered. Messerschmitts dove through clouds, but the bombers kept coming, day after day, week after week. Each American loss was replaced almost immediately. Each German loss took months to rebuild. And by mid-1944, the Luftwaffe's airfields were littered with wreckage, its ranks filled with half-trained cadets sent into hopeless fights. Göring, once proud of his invincible air arm, began issuing frantic orders, to no avail. The Luftwaffe had lost not just the air, but the war of production that decided it. In 1944, a new sound filled the skies over Europe. A high-pitched roar that meant death for the Luftwaffe. It came from the P-51 Mustang, a sleek, fast, long-range fighter that changed the air war forever. At first, the Mustang had been an experiment. Designed in Britain, refined in America, it was originally meant for reconnaissance. But when engineers fitted it with the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, everything changed. Suddenly, the Mustang could fly higher, faster, and farther than any fighter before it. For the first time, Allied bombers had a true escort, one that could follow them all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe's greatest advantage had always been reach. German fighters could attack bombers near the border, then retreat to refuel while American escorts turned back. But when the Mustangs arrived, that advantage disappeared overnight. Now the hunters became the hunted. P-51s cut through German formations with precision. They strafed airfields, attacked supply trains, and shot down aircraft as they tried to take off. Entire squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s were destroyed before they could climb into the clouds. In some missions, Mustang pilots claimed over 20 kills in a single day. The results were devastating. By mid-1944, Göring's airfields were empty, his pilots exhausted, and fuel so scarce that trainees practiced taxiing instead of flying. Every week, American production sent more Mustangs across the Atlantic. Planes built by the same assembly lines that once made cars. Each one cost the US about $50,000. Each German loss cost months of labor and materials they no longer had. When Göring saw contrails of American bombers stretching unopposed across the daylight sky, he reportedly said, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." The laughter that once filled the Reich Air Ministry was gone. The same machine he mocked had built a weapon that erased the Luftwaffe from the sky. As the Luftwaffe faded, the bombers took over. Day after day, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator filled the European skies, stretching from the Channel coast to the far side of Germany. Each carried 5 tons of bombs, escorted by swarms of P-51 Mustangs above and around them. From 1943 onward, the Allied bombing campaign became relentless. Factories, oil refineries, rail yards, and airfields vanished in sheets of fire. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, and Berlin were struck again and again until they were no longer cities, but landscapes of brick and smoke. The precision of the daylight raids was matched by the devastation of the Royal Air Force at night. The two together created a rhythm of destruction that Germany could no longer answer. Every target was chosen to crush the Reich's capacity to fight. When the bombers hit synthetic fuel plants at Lohna and Pellets, production collapsed. Tanks rolled to the front on fumes, and Luftwaffe pilots were grounded for lack of aviation fuel. Railway lines were severed. Bridges and factories disappeared overnight. By 1944, Göring's intelligence reports read like obituaries. Entire aircraft industries in Regensburg, Augsburg, and Schweinfurt were gone. Skilled workers were killed or trapped under rubble. Surviving engineers fled to underground tunnels, trying to build fighters in the dark. But nothing they built could match the tide. The United States was producing more aircraft in a single month than Germany could in a year. When Göring looked at his own air defense maps, he saw endless red tracks of bomber routes, proof that the Reich had lost the air. The fortresses flying over his capital were not just machines. They were symbols of industrial power beyond his comprehension. Each one carried the effort of 1,000 workers, the product of a system he had once mocked as inefficient. The laughter that began in Berlin in 1941 had turned into silence broken only by air raid sirens. Long before Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the United States had already won the real war, the industrial one. By the summer of 1944, American factories were producing more weapons, vehicles, and aircraft than the Axis powers combined. From Detroit to Seattle, more than 300,000 companies were linked in one vast network of production. The nation built 60,000 tanks, 100,000 aircraft, 6,000 ships, and millions of rifles, trucks, and artillery pieces. Every item had a serial number, every part a purpose. While Europe burned, America's assembly lines never stopped. Roosevelt's gamble had paid off. The promise of 50,000 planes was no longer a dream. It was a statistic surpassed twice over. The United States wasn't just supplying itself, it was supplying the world. Under the Lend-Lease program, thousands of aircraft and vehicles were shipped to Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. Every convoy that crossed the Atlantic carried the weight of American factories. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, the invasion fleet itself was a monument to this industrial miracle. Over 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 156,000 men crossed the Channel in a single coordinated assault. Behind them stood years of production, logistics, and engineering. An invisible army of workers who had turned steel and oil into victory. Hermann Göring had once said that numbers alone could not win a war. But in 1944, he was proven wrong. Numbers, built by hands in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle, were winning it every day. The war factories of America had achieved what its generals could not yet see, the complete exhaustion of Germany's ability to resist. By the time Allied soldiers set foot in Normandy, the outcome had already been forged in the furnaces of the arsenal of democracy. By late 1944, Germany's factories were dying one by one. The Allies didn't just bomb cities, they dismantled an economy. Each week, squadrons of B-17s and Lancasters erased another piece of the Reich's war machine. Rail yards, oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, synthetic fuel facilities. It wasn't simply destruction, it was methodical suffocation. The Ministry of Armaments, once managed by Albert Speer with ruthless efficiency, began to collapse under impossible strain. Factories that survived the bombing raids were starved of raw materials. Coal shipments couldn't move because rail lines were cut. Oil refineries no longer functioned. Even ammunition plants ran dry because trucks had no fuel to deliver shells. Underground production was tried. Makeshift assembly lines in tunnels and caves. But workers froze in winter. Machinery broke down. and Allied aircraft soon found those targets too. Every day, Germany lost another piece of its industrial lifeline. In the air, Göring's Luftwaffe no longer existed as a coherent force. Fighter squadrons had been reduced to a handful of aircraft. Jet projects like the Me-262 came too late, built in too few numbers to matter. Speer warned Hitler that production had fallen by more than half, but the Führer refused to believe it. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American industry had reached its peak. Shipyards built an entire Liberty ship in less than a week. Aircraft plants were producing more bombers in a month than Germany could build in a year. The contrast was absolute. One nation building faster than the other could rebuild. By early 1945, Göring's Reich Air Ministry, once filled with laughter and confidence, stood silent. The marble halls that had echoed with boasts now echoed with defeat. The man who laughed at America's 50,000 plane dream was watching the ruins of his own factories burn. The industrial war that began with arrogance had ended in ashes. When the war began, Hermann Göring believed technology and courage would decide the outcome. He saw warfare through the lens of the past, where skillful pilots and daring raids could turn the tide. But by 1944, that world no longer existed. Wars were no longer won by bravery alone. They were won by engines, fuel, and factories. Göring had mocked the American plan for 50,000 aircraft because he could not imagine a nation turning commerce into combat. He believed production was a matter of discipline and ideology, not organization and scale. He never understood that the same efficiency that built automobiles and refrigerators could build bombers and tanks. While Germany glorified soldiers, America glorified workers. And those workers would decide the future. Even as reports poured in, showing American output dwarfing his own, Göring clung to illusions. He claimed that German design superiority would offset the enemy's numbers. But by the time he admitted the truth, that numbers were everything, it was too late. The Reich had no fuel, no raw materials, and no time left. After the war, during his interrogation at Nuremberg, Göring was asked whether he had believed the Americans could produce 100,000 planes. He smiled bitterly and said, "No, and that was my greatest mistake." That mistake had cost him his air force, his pride, and his country. The man who once commanded the most advanced air arm in the world died knowing that he had lost not to superior tactics, but to superior industry. It wasn't a single battle that broke the Luftwaffe. It was an idea. An idea that arrogance could outmatch organization, and that willpower could outbuild machinery. History proved him wrong. By 1945, America had produced more planes than the rest of the world combined. The laughter that once echoed through Berlin's air ministry had been replaced by silence and surrender. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the assembly lines did not. The same machinery that had built bombers and tanks began turning out cars, refrigerators, and radios again. But the world it served had changed forever. America's wartime industry had created a blueprint for modern power. The United States had learned that economic strength was national strength. Factories could be repurposed, engineers retrained, and entire cities redirected to serve a single goal. This system became the foundation of the post-war order, what President Truman called the Great Workshop of Freedom. Airfields built for bombers became airports. Shipyards turned to building merchant fleets. The research that gave birth to radar, jet engines, and synthetic materials spilled into civilian life. The industrial network that once armed armies now fueled prosperity, but the deeper legacy was strategic. Every nation saw what American production had achieved. It wasn't just about weapons. It was about logistics, planning, and the ability to mobilize millions without collapsing. The arsenal of democracy had become the model for every superpower that followed. In Europe, cities lay in ruins, but American factories were untouched. That head start shaped the Cold War, rebuilding allies through the Marshall Plan, and supplying the tools that rebuilt Western Europe. In a world divided by ideology, the side that controlled production controlled destiny. Hermann Göring had once laughed at the idea that industry could win wars. The post-war years proved that industry would now decide everything: peace, reconstruction, and influence. America's wartime factories had not only defeated the Axis, they had created the modern era. By the end of the Second World War, the United States had built more than 300,000 aircraft. Over 100,000 of them combat planes. It was a number so large that even America's own generals struggled to comprehend it. Entire airfields were filled with bombers that never flew in combat, simply because there was no longer anyone left to fight. The sheer output transformed the very idea of air power. Before the war, a nation measured strength by the skill of its pilots or the quality of its aircraft. After 1945, strength was measured by production capacity, how fast a nation could build, replace, and project force. Quantity had become a form of strategy. Those 100,000 planes weren't just tools of war. They were the foundation of modern aviation. From their designs came the next generation of transport aircraft, jet fighters, and commercial planes. The factories that built the B-17s, B-24s, and P-51s evolved into the companies that would one day build the Boeing 707, the 747, and the spacecraft that reached the moon. In Europe, the wreckage of Göring's Luftwaffe still lay scattered across empty runways, silent reminders of how arrogance met reality. But in America, engineers were already looking forward, testing jet prototypes and planning the future of flight. The same system that once produced destruction would soon carry civilians across oceans. In a single decade, the US had gone from building 3,000 aircraft a year to shaping the age of global aviation. The challenge that Göring mocked had not only been met, it had redrawn the limits of what industry could achieve. What began as a target, 50,000 planes, became proof that no ambition was impossible when a nation's factories moved with a single purpose. The laughter that once echoed in Berlin had become history's quiet lesson. Never underestimate a country built on invention, organization, and will. In the end, Hermann Göring's laughter became a monument to disbelief. He had mocked the idea that the United States could build 50,000 planes. He had trusted in German genius, in discipline and willpower, and dismissed the quiet strength of assembly lines an ocean away. By 1945, the proof surrounded him. The sky over Germany belonged to the very machines he had once ridiculed. Endless formations of silver bombers, escorted by sleek American fighters. They came from Detroit and Seattle, from the fields of Kansas and the docks of California. They were the sound of factories working day and night, of welders, riveters, and engineers who had never seen the front, but who decided it nonetheless. Göring saw the ruins of his own airfields, the burned-out skeletons of the Luftwaffe, and finally understood. The war he had planned to win with daring and design had been lost to organization and endurance. The United States had not merely outfought Germany, it had outbuilt it. At Nuremberg, when the judges read the list of his crimes, Göring looked like a man haunted by his own arrogance. For all his boasts of air supremacy, his empire had been destroyed by numbers, by logistics, by a nation that had turned factories into fortresses. The laughter that once echoed through the Reich Air Ministry had given way to the hum of American industry, a sound that would shape the next century. The factories that built those bombers would go on to build the jets, the rockets, and the spacecraft that defined the modern world. Göring's Germany vanished. The age of American air power had just begun. And somewhere, in the silent wreckage of his lost air force, the echo of that laughter faded, replaced forever by the roar of engines built in a land he never understood.